everyone, this is Miss Moriarty, and I'm here to discuss with us our very last topic of the school year, as well as the last topic of Unit 9. So, remember, in our Unit 9, we have now discussed what has now happened to the ozone layer. How does it naturally deplete? How might human influence affect its depletion? What have we done to mitigate that? As well as what is the greenhouse effect? What is the result of increasing greenhouse gases? How does that relate to global warming, climate change, as well as endangered and invasive species? So, kind of putting that all together, all of those topics, uh, in some way, are going to impact the biodiversity found on Earth. Thinking back to topics from Unit 1 as well as Unit 2, we know a very biodiverse ecosystem is one that is very resilient and resistant to change. And so we want to ensure that we maintain biodiversity in every ecosystem that we can. So, there's actually an acronym that we use in APES to help us identify some of the common human impacts on biodiversity. So that's where HIPCO comes into play. Now, what does HIPCO stand for? The H stands for habitat destruction. I is invasive species. P, pollution. The other P is population. C is climate change. And O can sometimes be referred to as overexploitation or overharvesting. Each of these factors, in some way, play a role in harming the biodiversity on Earth. Now, in what way might each of these do that? Well, thinking back to all of the topics we have now covered in the entirety of the school year, we know that habitat destruction or fragmentation is oftentimes caused due to deforestation, right? Maybe we need to use that lumber for some sort of provisional service, or we need to build a city or roads to connect two towns. Maybe we need to drain a wetland area for urbanization purposes. River water, the levels in river water can be decreased, especially if we dam certain rivers and we affect the flow of that water. Each of these aspects are a part of habitat fragmentation, which have the ability to lower biodiversity. Invasive species, right? We talked about today invasive species, and in the spring break assignment, we know that these are organisms that are non native and can easily invade an area and kind of outcompete the other organisms that are there. We know that in some cases, we can even see when an invasive comes into an ecosystem, it can actually drive the other organisms in that ecosystem to being threatened or even endangered. Population growth, a part of all the problems that we face, is really due to human population growth. I mean, the more and more humans that we're going to house and provide resources to means that there's going to be more urbanization and more deforestation and expansion. With more of these comes more and more pollution, right? The use of more resources for energy purposes might mean more frequent oil spills. Having more crops to provide to a greater population means maybe we need to use more fertilizers, more pesticides, and so on. Using the machinery involved in all of those pieces. We know is a driving force of climate change, right? Producing all of those greenhouse gases is going to wind up changing global temperatures, changing annual precipitation in certain areas, shifting biomes, changing the range of organisms, and unfortunately, the species that can adapt to those changes may go extinct. And then lastly, over exploitation or over harvesting, right? The excessive hunting of certain organisms or even overfishing in certain areas drives down the population in those areas, leading to potential extinction. So here we see habitat fragmentation occurs when very large habitats usually get broken down into smaller, more isolated areas. This is usually driven by the construction of roads, maybe pipelines, maybe clearing a land for agricultural purposes. Now, the scale of that habitat fragmentation has an adverse effect on the inhabitants of that given ecosystem. So However, that can vary from species to species. Ones that maybe are more generalist in terms of their niche may have a better time adapting to those changes than a species who is maybe more specialist, right? Where it really requires all of those pieces in the ecosystem in order to survive. Another factor that plays a role in biodiversity, especially when talking about agricultural purposes, is domestication. We actually see fewer plant species tend to be grown, and that's due to selective breeding as well as genetic modification. And we tend to use those two pieces to try and produce a higher yield species. But as a result, we tend to kind of lower the variation since now we're only selecting for those desired characteristics at this point. Now, how might climate change and biodiversity play a role? Well, we know that if temperatures are going to change, if precipitation patterns are going to change, these are two selective pressures that organisms have to somewhat adapt to. And the organisms that are going to wind up surviving and reproducing more than others are going to wind up being the more fit individuals in their then environment. And so the species that can't do that, unfortunately, will then become threatened, maybe endangered, or even extinct in the future. Now, an interesting phenomenon that tends to take place, especially when we talk about biodiversity and climate change, are actually species found within the edge of habitats. So, this is where two ecosystems tend to intertwine with one another. These species actually tend to be very specialized in what they do and where they do their stuff, but we tend to see lots of biodiversity in these areas, and we tend to call this the edge effect. And so, with climate change, right, changing temperatures, precipitation, widening certain biomes, shrinking others, we tend to see the organisms that live along this edge of the habitat being impacted greatly by these changes. Now, what can we do to mitigate biodiversity loss? Well, the first thing we can do is protect any important types of habitats. We can establish maybe a national park or a preserve in order to prevent any form of development, prevent any form of habitat destruction. We can connect any fragmented now habitats with wildlife corridors. This can enable the organisms that reside there to move or breed or migrate if they need to. In terms of urbanization, we can establish urban growth boundaries and prevent any more urbanization from then expanding and increasing that urban sprawl. We can potentially already expand the parks that we have, create more urban gardens, green roofs, and city like environments to make more habitats for species. We can implement greater sustainable agricultural practices, reduce our use of water and pesticides. Um, we could potentially lower our meat consumption, which we know helps in preventing habitat loss, as well as decreases greenhouse gas emissions. Any clear cut forests, we could go in and potentially replant them in order to then reestablish the ecosystem. So, there are tons of things we can do to mitigate biodiversity loss. But the main piece here, guys, thinking back to human impacts on biodiversity, think back to that HIPCO acronym, right? The H standing for habitat destruction, the I, invasive species, the two P's is pollution, population, C is climate change, and O is the overharvesting of organisms. All right, everyone. That is it for our topic of 9.10, as well as the remaining content of the school year. Tomorrow, we're going to be doing a little round robin jigsaw involving our HIPCO acronym. So if you are done watching the video, you took your notes, you can please just mark this as done.